Without any further ado, Linda Coombs, everyone.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you, everyone, for coming out. Just to give you a little information about my background, I've spent a lot of years, I should probably say a lot of decades now, working in museums. I started out at the Boston Children's Museum, where I worked for a total of 11 years, 30 years at Plymouth Plantation in the Wampanoag Indigenous program there, which is where I learned most of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. And I worked at the Aquinnah Cultural Center, which is a small house museum on Martha's Vineyard in Aquinnah, which is about Aquinnah Wampanoag history. So as Corey has said, the title of my talk is Cornmeal Injun Dumplings, Wampanoag Traditional Gardens and the Real Meaning of Caring for the Land. And I'm going to be reading a lot from a paper, so if it looks like I'm just staring at my keyboard, that's because I am, because I like to be able to see what I'm trying to say here. Corn has a very special meaning, has a very special place in the cultures of the indigenous people who grew it. It is a plant that was cultivated and developed about 8,000 years ago by indigenous people in Mexico. They developed many types of corn that would grow in a variety of climates, hot, cooler, arid, or wet, as well as at different elevations. Over time and generations, corn spread north and south, reaching the Northeast here approximately 1,500 years ago. Our history tells us that Wampanoag people received corn from the Crow, who flew here from the Creator's Garden in the Southwest, carrying a corn kernel in one ear and a bean in the other. Notice I refer to this as history and not as myth. This may be expressed in a different way from what Western scientists would say, but that does not mean it's wrong, that it's myth or fairy tale. This story does give us some specific information. The Wampanoag belief of where the Creator resides and where we originally got corn from. We learned from other tribes who already had corn the planting method that became ours. Corn became central in our culture and our lives were directed around its planting and cultivation. Before corn, we had always been hunters, fishermen, and foragers. We had long ago developed ways of taking, with the realization that we had to give back. We followed our original instructions, which teach that all life is sacred. All life is sacred. All living things have the right to their own lives and ways of being. We realized that we as humans were not above any other being in creation, but that we have our place in creation and our responsibilities to creation. That when we take any life in support of our own, we must do so with respect and in the knowledge that the beings are giving their lives to us. We understand that we should not take wantonly. It is our job, our responsibility as humans, to keep the balance of creation as Creator made it. So when the corn came here, we had to behave differently and find a balanced way to include this spirit into our lives. Planting corn requires clearing woods or meadows to make planting fields. It requires breaking the soil and digging in the breast of Mother Earth. These actions should not happen without caring, respect, and reciprocity. I have a quote here from a man named Roderico Tenney, who is from Guatemala, and this is from 1989. And this is in reference to the practice of his people down there. They ask permission of the spirits on behalf of this being, which is the corn, so that as they disturb the natural vegetation of the place to clear some land, they won't incur the wrath of the tree spirits and the other vegetation that they must disturb in order to plant. Incurring the wrath of spirits, etc., may sound like superstitious nonsense or something similar. But let's set that notion aside and look at the reality. This is paying due respect to the trees and to the other plants that must give their lives so that we can grow corn. So Creator gave us ceremony as the means to show proper respect, to give thanks for the sacrifice of those lives. Ceremony, prayer, thanksgiving is given before any life is taken. Corn is recognized as a female spirit, so therefore it is the women who tended it and nurtured it in our traditional lives. By the 17th century, Wampanoag people had been organized into 69 villages, each averaging about 1,000 people. Within the territory of each village were the winter dwelling sites, which were away from the coastal areas and back into the shelter of the forests. And there were the summer planting sites that were lived in by individual families from early spring through harvest. The sachems or chiefs of the villages kept track of which fields could be planted and which needed to lie fallow. He or she directed families to their respective planting areas where they would return each spring for 5, 6, or 7 years in a row. Each family's field was about 1 to 2 acres. So if the fields needed to be cleared for planting, it was done with ceremony. Men and women would help with this as felling of trees landed on the men's to-do list. Roger Williams observed in 1643, when a field is to be broken up, they have a very loving, sociable, speedy way to dispatch it. All the neighbors, men and women, 40, 50, even 100, and so on, join and come in to help freely. And what stands out in Williams' description? That people were loving, sociable, willing to help for the good of the community. The men also used fire as a tool in clearing the fields. Controlled burns were done, and the ashes worked back into the soil. People would then reform the same mounds and continue to plant in them, even if after several years of lying fallow. This is also the time of year the herring were coming up the river on their spawning runs. They were thick and plentiful back then and were caught for food and for fertilizer, although they were not used for fertilizer every year, but only as needed. There are certain signs in nature that indicated when it's time to plant. People watched for when the shad bush bloomed, or when the leaves of the oak tree are the size of a mouse's ear. You got to look really close for that one. And this indicates that there's no more danger of frost and it's safe to plant. This is around the time of the new moon in May, which this year is May 11th, by the way, which is also the Wampanoag New Year. We had New Year at the time when things were being born, things coming back new, after the winter. At planting time, the women performed planting ceremonies. This again was not some act of superstition or hoping for a good harvest, but rather to pay respect to the corn and the other seeds in acknowledging their gift to us, offering thanks to the Creator. All the vegetables were planted in mounds. There were usually 4 to 6 corn seeds planted first on top of the mounds and allowed to grow to about 6 inches in height. Then 4 bean seeds were planted about halfway down the mound, evenly spaced around. And then 4 squash, pumpkin, or melon seeds evenly spaced around the base of the mound. Sunflowers were grown around the edges of the gardens. The corn was given a head start so that it would have the strength to support the climbing beans. It was a beanpole, in other words. People didn't have the modern scientific terms, but they did have the understanding of how these crops grew together and enhanced each other's growth. During the summer, great care was taken to keep blackbirds and the crows from plucking the seed or the newly sprouted plants out of the ground. Corn watchtowers were placed in the middle of the gardens, and the children were given the job of sitting there at dawn and at dusk to scare away any of these critters that would come in and snap up the corn. At night, men would walk the perimeter of the gardens to keep away deer and other larger, corn thieves, away from their growing crops. The women were very fastidious in keeping the weeds down so they wouldn't steal nutrients from the vegetables. Hoes were made with the scapula of deer or elk, and they were not meant to be used to break up the ground because they're too fragile, but they were used to scrape the weeds off the surface of the ground and away from the corn and everything. Midsummer in July, the mounds were hilled up once again to support the growing corn stalks. July also saw the first green beans mature, and the people held green bean ceremony. In August, the corn has grown into its milk stage, and people gave thanks with green corn ceremonies. Seems like life just revolved around these times of ceremony. And in September, all the crops started to bear their full fruit. The women made sure that what was not eaten immediately was dried carefully to preserve it and keep it for winter use. The best ears of corn were saved for seed. Ears that didn't form completely or had a plump worm were not discarded, but the good kernels were scraped off of the cob using a scraper made from a deer jaw. It was the teeth that removed the kernels from the cob. They were then laid out on a mat to be dried in the sun. Back in 1995, I was very fortunate to have been invited to go to a corn husking bee up on the Tuscarora Reservation, which is part of the Iroquois people up in upstate New York. And when we got there, the farmer had this huge barn that was maybe, 40 feet wide. And in the middle of the floor, there was this humongous pile of corn. You could walk around it, but it basically took up the width of that barn. And it was at least 10 feet high. And apparently it wasn't that good of a year for the corn. He must have had to build another barn if he had a good year, I don't know. And we were instructed that to take the individual ears of corn, and we'd peel back all the husks and remove them except for 3. And the best ears of corn, as I was saying a moment ago, those went to the farmer and he set them aside for seed. All of the good ears, we removed the husks, peeled back the other 3, put them in a bushel basket. When the basket was full, we took them out front, and there were some men out there that were taking these ears of corn by the husk and braiding them together. So you had a bushel of ears of corn braided together in one long strand, and they'd braid the husk up and around and back into itself like a loop. And then that was hung in the corn crib, and that corn would dry. And when this flint corn, which is a type that we grew, and the Iroquois have their own varieties because the corn was grown so long, they developed distinct varieties. But it's like dry beans. So it's whole and not shrunken, and it's hard like a dry bean. From the time of the arrival of the Europeans, Wampanoag people were subjected to many forms of colonial pressure and oppression. This was aimed at changing us to be like the English or to annihilate us. These processes caused huge shifts in the way we interacted with the land, including the way we farmed. Men became the farmers, and our lands divided up into allotments, which was really just another way to take it from us and to separate us from it. In the Wampanoag language, the word for land is Aki. However, you can't just use Aki in a sentence. The land has to belong to somebody. It's just the way the language works. So if I were to say my land, I would say Nataki. But I have to add a suffix to make it proper usage. So I would say Natakim with an M on the end. And what that M does, it tells you that myself and the land are one thing, that we are inalienable, we are inseparable, we are the same. Okay. Speaking of our language, something that was a huge help in getting it back were many documents written in the Wampanoag language from the middle of the 17th century. But what happened is that by the middle of the 18th century, we began to notice that that M was being dropped off the end of the word. Okay, that suffix was being dropped because people began to really understand that we could be separated or at least prevented from interacting with the land in the way that we felt we're supposed to be. So losing the land, the taking of our land interrupted our gardening, foraging, hunting, fishing, travel, dwelling areas, just overturned our whole culture. That M suffix dropped as people saw the land being taken. It may have been taken by so-called legal means, according to Plymouth Colony or Mass Bay Colony, whatever. But we still know we were part of it and that it is part of us. We are relatives. We are one thing. So in spite of all the changes wrought by colonial oppression, many of us stayed in our ancient homeland. And people tend to want to do what they've always done. Sometimes people will say, well, how come you're still Indian? Or how do you know that? Or why do you still do this? And it's like, well, kind of human nature just to do what you've always done. You know, not many people like change. So we continue to hunt and fish and forage and farm. In spite of everything else that was going on in the late 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, people continued doing these things that make us who we are. We walk on our homeland, feel the presence of our ancestors within us, and we hunt, fish, forage, and garden. While we incorporated European vegetables like carrots, peas, turnips, onions, as well as those that came to us via Europe, like potatoes. Potatoes are originally from South America, went to Ireland and came back over here. We still grew our traditional corn, beans, squashes, and pumpkins. And we grew those in the old way because it worked. People still hunt and fish, but also raised cattle and oxen, sheep, pigs, and chickens. This was our basic way of life into the mid-20th century. Between 2010 and 2018, I worked at the Aquinnah Cultural Center, which I mentioned earlier. In its collection, the ACC, as we call it, holds over 40 interviews that were done with elders in the 1970s and the 1980s. One of the ladies interviewed was a woman named Phyllis Vanderhoop. She was better known by her nickname of Fiddy. Fiddy was born in 1915 and lived to be 100 years old. In her interview, she speaks of growing up in Aquinnah, or Gay Head, as it was called back then, or as it was called actually for 2 or 3 centuries. This is what Fiddy has to say. In Gay Head, there was no need for hunger here. Maybe hunger for things we didn't have, but nature provided for us very well. We had much fishing, and we had clams and quahogs and eels, lobster, and in the wintertime, of course, things would be a little scarce, as the old folks called it. And then my mother used to make eel stifle or clams stifle, It was made like the potato bargain, and then the eels were put on the top, and then on top of that would be the cornmeal Injun dumplings, and they were just like sinkers. Oh boy, they went down and they really stayed down. Of course, cooked up with onions, they were really delicious. Can also be made with quahogs and clams. That phrase, cornmeal Injun dumplings, hit me like a ton of bricks. For Fitty to use the term Injun, she was not being derogatory. I realized she meant the cornmeal was made from our original indigenous flint corn, the same as our ancestors grew and was still being grown and used into the mid 20th century. Quaker cornmeal won't make sinkers because it's been processed and degerminated. Sweet corn won't dry to be made into meal, as I was explaining how the flint corn dries like a dry bean, it's whole. And that's because it's a hybrid. So the Indian flint corn is the type needed, unprocessed and whole, to make such Injun dumplings. We had managed to continue our relationship with this corn spirit over these last 4 centuries. And just a note on the word Injun. In the 17th century, there were dialects in the English language coming from England, where when you found the letters DI together, like in the word Indian, it was pronounced like a J. So Indian became Injun. And that was just the way they pronounced it. Nothing bad was meant. And we learned English from those people in the 17th century. And a lot of times sounds or different pronunciations, will stay within the community. I was talking once with a man, a Mashpee Wampanoag man, and when he said the word work, he pronounced it work. Really sort of a weird pronunciation. And I was like, well, and I heard a lot of the old timers, either Mashpee Wampanoag or the old Cape Codders from the old, original families, they would pronounce it like that. The only other place I've heard that said like that was in the Pilgrim Village at Plymouth Plantation, was somebody who was representing a person, portraying a person, role-playing a person from that part of England. So very interesting stuff. And the term Injun only came to be used in a derogatory fashion, later on. So in closing, Wampanoag or indigenous people worked with the land in a living, reciprocal relationship. Each of us, everything in creation, has a place, a purpose, a reason for being in Creator's plan, even if we don't know what that is. It is the responsibility of humans to keep the earth as it was created. There's a book called The Daughters of Copper Woman, which is actually about Indian people. I can't remember which exact people, but they're on the Northwest coast, like Washington State or up into Canada there. And the story's being told by a young woman, and she's talking about her grandmother and what her grandmother was relating about the history of their people with the coming of Europeans and all the rest of it. And there's another statement in there, again, that hit me like a ton of bricks, because the woman said, destruction is evil. Think about that in terms of what we today call development or progress, when we have to cut down the forests for solar farms or housing developments or strip malls or big malls. How is it progress when we are destroying what the Creator or what God has made? When the Europeans came here in the 16th and 17th century, some people wrote down, they described what they saw. They saw huge forests that went on forever, trees that were 100 feet tall, 6 feet in diameter, huge herds of animals. I don't know if herd's the right word for all animals, but you get my meaning. And like the deer, for example, were plentiful. And that was an animal that we hunted because we used it for food. We used it for clothing. Right now, it takes about 8 deer skins for me to make an outfit for me or any adult person. And okay, so the deer in the 17th century did get to be larger. So let's say maybe it took 5 or 6. And as I said, we had 1,000 people in 69 villages. So we'll round that up, give or take, to 70,000 people times 5 skins. That's 350,000 deer skins. Yet the herds of deer were not diminished. There were flocks of birds where one flock would number in the millions. The waters were pristine. The fish coming up the rivers on their spawning runs were so thick, you could walk across them on their backs, walk across the river on their backs. Life was lush and full and abundant. The English thought that we were backward, primitive, that we were without religion, art, or science. But let's look at the evidence. Consider the abundance of life we had lived in for millennia, which happened not randomly or happenstance, but because we understood how to maintain the balance of creation. Then consider all the destruction of today's progress, which has brought us what? To the verge of disappearing with climate change and sea level rise and all the rest of it. We have air pollution, water pollution, species extinction, several or many per day. Destruction of the earth, clear-cutting forests, nastying the waters, polluting the waters, not to mention the attitude toward other human beings. So I hope you'll reflect on all of this, because we're certainly not living the fairy tale. I thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, be glad to answer them. And I really like Pam Hill's chicken.
So as Linda says, we're at the Q&A section of tonight's event. If you want, the way it's going to work is if you have questions, put them into the chat, and then I will ask them to Linda as the moderator, and that's how we're going to go. We've got several minutes for this, so feel free to send those questions along. Everyone's just generating ideas right now. Oh, that's a cool one. This is from Julia. Did the Wampanoag, oh, now it's disappearing on me. Did the Wampanoag forage beach plums?
Yes. Beach plums are an indigenous plant. We did utilize them. Yep.
All right. The next one we got is from Vanessa. Are the ancestral varieties of corn still around? And do people still grow and harvest them?
Yes, again. I don't know if we have any corn left from Wampanoag people, because in the 50-year span or 60, 70, whatever now, I don't know if anyone saved any. But the Iroquois people and many other people, many other tribes that grow corn, the Hopi, I know the Iroquois have a program with Cornell University to preserve not only the corn, but the beans and the squashes and the pumpkins, whatever. So yeah, they're very lively, healthy programs, thankfully.
The next question we've got is from Kimberly. What are the modern issues Wampanoag face today?
Well, where should I start? Well, the first thing that came to mind, the situation is resolved now since Joe Biden got in, but last year at this time and through the summer, the Mashpee tribe was fighting for its land base, which now is a mere 321 acres. We face a lot of ignorance because people don't understand our history. They don't understand our culture. There's a lot of, expectation that we're no longer like our ancestors, that we know nothing of our history or our culture ourselves. And people expect us to act like they do. And, in spite of everything, we're not like that. So, there's a lot of issues. I mean, at Aquinnah, we had quite a number of years of elders luncheons, and we had them once a month, and we'd hold, one month on the island, the next month at some restaurant off island somewhere. We have a large community in New Bedford, so it might be over there. Um, and we'd also often have a speaker or some sort of a activity or whatever, and they would ask me to speak a lot. And so one day we ended up talking about education and the education experience that we'd been through. So here I am in a room with like 60 people that were in their 60s ranging up to their 80s. And as far as the way they looked, to range from looking like a white person, run down the spectrum, to looking into a black person, but still with, Wampanoag. And every one of these people has some story to tell of when they were children. And here they are as elders remembering this because it was traumatic for them, where they were told that they weren't Wampanoag, that they shouldn't lie, that, they just weren't believed by their teachers. So, and that's very painful. That's something I've experienced myself. And, and as for myself, I've come to realize that, it doesn't matter what people believe about me, because it doesn't actually change what I am. So I found that very helpful. So, but, there's a lot of things that people face, those are just a few examples, I guess.
Next one we have is from Irving. Irving wants to know, did they use salt hay and how?
Salt hay. Not to my knowledge. I think the English used it. They harvested it for the cattle or some use like that. I'm not even sure about that, but I've never heard of us using salt hay or anything like weaving or food or anything like that. So
The next question comes in from Shelley. Shelley wants to know, is there a cookbook with traditional recipes in it? Or do they still exist?
There's a lot of cookbooks out there. Earl Mills from the Mashpee tribe has one, the Cape Cod Wampanoag cookbook. I don't know. I know there's others. I just can't think. If you hadn't asked me the question, I probably could have rattled that one right off. But now it was the only one that I can think of. And you might not think that some of the recipes are traditional, but tradition changes over time. Culture changes over time. It's never a static thing. It's fluid. And it's the same thing with food. So it's like we had clams. We always had clams. Today, people eat fried clams. So you might find a specific batter recipe for your fried clams in Earl's book. It's also good to read stuff. He has another book called The Son of Mashpee, and he talks. Earl's like 90 or over 90 now, and he talks about growing up in Mashpee and being out in the woods, and people did a lot of foraging for food or medicine, and things like that. So you get that whole context that the whole garden thing fit into.
Our next question comes from, it's an email address, so it's kind of, I don't know what the exact what person's name is, but from Human. And the question is, How are Wampanoag farmers doing now?
Um, well, certainly it is not like a main way of life anymore, like it was even 50, 75 years ago. Um, but there are people who have at least a vegetable garden or a few raised bed. There's a guy that lives right down the street from me that he gets corn from Iroquois folks, and that traditional flint corn, and he grows that. Um, and I know a lot of people are into the indigenous food sovereignty movement, if you will, and just do a lot of great things that you wouldn't think, all sorts of different things that come under that umbrella of indigenous food sovereignty. And the Narragansett people in Rhode Island, they have a tribal farm, so that's really an organized effort to preserve traditional foods and medicines and the wild plants and all the rest of it. So there is a lot going on in this area.
This is from Pam Hill. She says, I love my chicken too. This one has survived fox attack last fall. And she also really enjoyed the crow bringing the corn and beans in their ear. She wants to know, where did the squash seed come from?
I think squash is an indigenous plant, if I'm not mistaken. And the type of squashes that we grew were not butternut, because that's a 20th century hybrid. Um, we grew like Hubbard squashes, acorns, patty pans, crookneck summer squashes. There's a one that's, when I worked at the plantation, we used to get seeds from the person who was the horticulturalist at the plantation, and he handed me a pack of the seeds one year, and it said neck pumpkins. So I was like, oh, yeah, okay, pumpkins. So I'm expecting orange round things, And what I got were these plants, these vegetables that looked like a butternut squash, except it was huge and it had this huge crook neck, hence a neck pumpkin. And they weighed a ton. I'd never seen anything like it. Pumpkins, and a lot of the beans, like we had cranberry beans, what are called horticultural beans or field beans, Jacob's cattle, kidney beans, pea beans, um, yellow eyes. There's a whole different variety that are the type of beans that we grew, and they've just come out into the world more generally. And the type of pumpkins that we grew are now called like Connecticut field pumpkins. Okay, but that's just our, old indigenous plants.
So the next question comes from Hecate Healing Arts. First, they say, thank you so much, Linda, for sharing your wisdom. And now, knowing the many programs that exist like the Language Reclamation Program, I'm wondering if there are programs to teach traditional gardening farming techniques that touch on sustainability. Would this be something that at some point could be offered to present-day colonial settler descendants who, like their original ancestors, are pretty much clueless and once again could use some tutoring?
Um, well, other than individual people, having gardens or maybe a small group of people, whether it's Mashpee or Aquinnah or Herring Pond tribe in South Plymouth, um, probably the most organized garden, at least at one time, was the garden that we had in the Wampanoag Indigenous program at the plantation. Because that's when a lot of our people learned, that old traditional method. And a lot of times, I mean, there's a lot of people, non-native people who want to grow these Three Sisters gardens with the corn, beans, and squash as a school project or, or what have you. So they are out there. Um, they're not difficult to do.
The
It's
next,
not, I mean, it's not like information that's just being held within the tribe. It's out there for, general use. I would just advise using it like we did it, because that would be the best way to do it.
the next question we have is from Brandon. Brandon wants to know, what's the process for long-term corn storage? For example, when we read about the English digging up and stealing Wampanoag corn, what was that preparation process like, and does that differ from how corn is stored today?
Well, the corn back then was simply dried on the ear, unless you had a damaged or incomplete ear. Then, as I said, the kernels were scraped off and dried and then stored. And people would leave dry food in a storage pit at the winter site, for when they returned in the fall or when they returned in the spring, whatever. And that included the seed corn. And a storage pit might be, it was a hole in the ground that was lined with stones, which would keep out burrowing critters, and they would line the inside of the stone with bulrush mats. Bulrushes are a freshwater reed, and we boiled them to remove the sap before they were woven into mats. And that left that reed, or the reeds woven into a mat, so that it would absorb humidity and dampness and that sort of thing, where they were used on the inside of the houses to insulate. And in the storage pits, they would keep the dampness from the earth from getting into the food. Because once you dry food, you have to make sure it's kept absolutely dry, because it's the moisture that will make it rot. But as long as it's kept dry, it'll last indefinitely. So that was the basic technique that people used. And having done it for 1,000 years, you kind of get the knack for it down.
The next question we have from Human again. Was Woods Hole summer farmland?
Possibly. The planting areas were usually around ponds, along rivers, on the coastal areas, because those are your lowest points of land coming, downhill from mountains or hills or whatever. And so that's where your best or most fertile soil is, because it washes downhill.
The next one comes in from Jim. Jim wants to know, any thoughts on cranberry cooking? What about pemmican? And does anyone still make it?
We did not make pemmican. That's a food that was made by the Western, like Indians on the plains, and didn't have to be cranberries. It could be, any type of berry. But was that question about cranberries specifically, or?
I think it's three different ones. I think it's, what do you think about cranberry cooking? Question mark. What about pemmican? Question mark. And then, does anyone still make it? Question mark.
Well, yes, people do still make pemmican, but just that's not one of our traditional foods, so we don't make it. And as far as cranberry cooking, the Aquinnah tribe has wild cranberry bogs on our tribal lands. Okay, and back in Fiddy's day, they had Cranberry Day, and people were traveling via ox cart, and they would cook all kinds of food and pack up the food in the ox cart, put the kids in the ox cart, and they trundle down to the bogs, and they might spend several days down there harvesting. There used to be a series of cottages, and there's like one left. They were taken out in the hurricane of 38. And but they would just harvest and share the food they had brought. And I mean, they were getting cranberries out of there by the gallons, and especially in the early part of the 20th century, they were selling cranberries, not just, they use it for their own to make jam or sauce or what have you. But they were also selling them as a means of income. And but cranberries were always used along with other berries. And cranberries were one berry that was dried for, for use over the winter as well, to be reconstituted in some fashion, in a tea or in a soup or, that sort of thing.
Next question we have is from Larissa. They want to know, can you speak to traditional medicinal plants?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, because there was one thing I wanted to include in my talk and I just realized I'd forgot it. So here's my opening. I don't know a whole lot about what plants were used medicinally. I just know that they were. Because that's what people had and it worked. And the story I wanted to tell was that, I've been doing some consulting work with the Wellfleet Historical Society. And last summer we, developed an exhibit that's now in there. And now we're working on an exhibit about this Wampanoag woman, Delilah Sampson Gibbs. And Delilah was born mid to late 18th century. I don't think her birth date is really known. And she died in 1839. And of course, Wellfleet by that time, was Wellfleet. It had, the non-native people living down there in the town and the whole thing. And Delilah was friends with a white family by the name of Freeman, and particular friends with this one woman, Elizabeth Freeman. I don't know if they were like same age or, what have you, but the Elizabeth developed breast cancer. Okay, so this is circa, I always say 1820, it's a nice round number, because Delilah died in 39 of that century. And I can't imagine getting breast cancer at that period of time, but Delilah had the knowledge to go out into the woods and collect certain plants. And she made a poultice of these plants and she applied it to the woman's tumor or whatever. And I don't know how long she had to do that. It was changed every day. And finally, one day, the poultice came off and the tumor came right with it. And that woman was healed and she lived, And it seems like the only people that knew this until now was within the Freeman family. It came down within the Freeman family. And I'm like, my God, here's somebody that cured cancer with plants. And it just gets brushed off like nothing. I mean, speaking of stuff that Wampanoag people had to face, that's the type of thing that happens. It is historical erasure, basically. So we're doing this exhibit, on Delilah, so we can, talk about her knowledge. I mean, and her knowledge, and also the landscape had to be intact, in its original form for those plants to grow. Because I mean, you can, if you were to transplant them into a garden, you wouldn't have the same plants. I don't know if that makes sense, but you've changed them from where they originally grew, and they won't do the same thing. So I mean, that's such an amazing story, and I was mentioning that the 40-something interviews at the Aquinnah Cultural Center, and a lot of people are mentioning different plants like thoroughwort, and I heard that one a lot. They didn't really say what it was used for, but the herbal knowledge and Indian doctors were very much a part of the 17th, 18th, and even 19th centuries. And it's just something. I mean, there's a lot of people that are interested in having this knowledge, but it's just not like it was, at one time.
Next question we have is from Mary. Are you connected to the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project? And could you speak a little bit about that?
Well, my connection to the language project was that over the years, I've taken several of the classes, and some of them couple times. It's a difficult language. Um, and then a couple of years ago, I worked for them for a few months, which is very interesting. And what the language was begun in 1992, and it was founded by Jessie Baird from the Mashpee tribe. And she was researching and working on it on her own. And she ended up receiving a fellowship from MIT, and which was for a year. And then she stayed at MIT for another year to get her master's degree in linguistics, in Wampanoag linguistics specifically, because they do have that. And then she came home and began teaching in the community. And over the years, you know, I don't know, maybe 10 to 12 years ago, she started to build the immersion school that we have now. And she started out by hiring several apprentices. I think there were like 3 or 4 people at a time. And that went on for 2 or 3 years of, worth of apprentices, where she worked with them to get their language proficiency up so they could teach. They also received their teacher certification from the state. And they were initially going to form a charter school, and that whole process fell through, and it just didn't work out. So they switched to a Montessori style. So some of the teachers have gone through Montessori training as well, and some have continued on in school to get degrees in the language. And so now they have preschool through 2nd grade. And the plan was to like add a grade every year up through 6th grade, because the school right now is in Mashpee. And so the kids would, they get out of right now 2nd grade, transition over to the public school. And I mean, the hope is that, eventually they'll be able to transition from 6th grade into junior high at the public school, where Wampanoag language is offered as a class in the middle and high schools. So they get this consistent 12-year, serving of it, if you will. And they also presently have elders classes. There's 2 elementary schools, and there's after school classes now in each of the elementary schools, community classes. And then, as I said, there's Wampanoag language is offered in the high school to any student, which is the first time it's been offered to non-native people. We wanted to keep it within the community until, our own people had proficiency with it before we opened it up to other people. So it's the most impressive thing that Wampanoag people have going on, I think. And there's a film, We Still Live Here. I don't know if you've heard of it, but that is about the founding of the language project and also contains some of the history. So
You can get that movie from the Clam system if you would like to watch it. So just contact your local library. We'll get it for you. Next question comes in from Hecate Healing Arts again. Are there any restaurants that you know of that offer traditional Wampanoag food?
Well, there used to be the Flume restaurant, and that was operated by Earl Mills, the author I was mentioning a little while ago. And he opened the Flume in the in the 60s, I think. And he ran it for, and he mostly hired Wampanoag people, either as cooks or wait staff or what have you. So, I mean, he was working within the community and giving them training. And it was, really a good thing. And, you could get foods that we consider traditional today. Okay. Like I said, tradition and culture are not static things. They change because everything else changes in life, So you could get fish or fried fish, but you could get jag and linguiça, which is, something that we've incorporated into our traditional foods now, so. But you know, Earl, as I said, he's in his 90s now, and he must have closed that restaurant about 15 years ago. He just retired. So, and unless you're ordering fried, you know, fish or something like that, or corn or beans or squash, I mean, those are our traditional foods. So, you know.
And that was the last question we have in the chat. So it's exactly 7:30. So that is a perfect time for us to wrap up. One of the things I didn't read that was throughout all the comments was everyone saying a big thank you for doing this, Linda. Everyone's really glad to learn from you and to share all this stuff. And you're getting a bunch more thank yous pooling in right now. But yeah, so what we'll do is if everyone wants to just silently clap or give a wave, we're gonna wrap up tonight. Linda, if you'll just stick around for a minute, we'll just finish this up. And everyone else, after you give your wave, just feel free to log off. And if you need anything else, feel free to contact Sturgis Library. And we're here for you guys. So have an awesome night.